I'm going to be talking today about implementation science in general. I'm going to be doing a bit of a deeper dive into some of the concepts that Clay introduced earlier, and then I'm going to be talking specifically a bit more after that about kind of school level, organizational level constructs that are critical to implementation. Because as Clay was saying, and as I think has already come up a little bit today, when we're talking about implementation, we're talking about really a multi-level process. And there are sort of belief and individual level variables that are critical for successful implementation. And obviously those are the individuals who are ultimately making the decision to adopt a new practice. But as you go up, there's also very important organizational and larger system issues that are going to be very impactful. And are going to dictate whether effective practices can really be used to improve the lives of kids. So just a few notes about collaborators and funding. Clay, and these are other people from the Smart Center and some of our colleagues in San Diego and elsewhere that we've been working with surrounding some of this more organizationally focused work. And we've had some funding from a number of different places, including, fingers crossed, perhaps from the Institute of Education Sciences to move forward with some of this work as well surrounding assessment of organizational constructs as they relate to implementation. So first I want to begin with an apology. Edward Tufte is a statistician and a visual designer, really focuses on information design. He's very critical of PowerPoint as a crutch for the presenter, unnecessarily linear. And he says every time you make a PowerPoint, or someone said, every time you make a PowerPoint, Edward Tufte kills a kitten. So I want to apologize for all the kittens that are about to perish as I continue with my PowerPoint. So today, I'm going to begin by talking again about key constructs and findings from implementation science in general. What do we know? What are some of the major takeaways from this really relatively recently emerged field that has grown pretty rapidly? Used to be called other things. It's been called a number of things. Knowledge translation is sort of one larger term, I think, that is used more internationally. Implementation science has become sort of the, I think, term of preference within the States. I'll be talking about the importance of a multi-level approach, key components of the organizational implementation context, which is sort of the term we're using to describe some of the pieces of organizations and organizational processes that we're focusing on, and then applications to school-based mental and behavioral health. So why do we need implementation? A lot of reasons. One of the reasons is because it can take 17 years for just 14% of original research to benefit actual practice. This is from healthcare, and a number of my examples will be from healthcare, not all of them. And this is a very commonly cited study that tried to determine the extent to which sort of new research findings were getting into practice and found this isn't happening. This is, I think we can all agree that is kind of dismal and that we can do a lot better. Studies of typical services reveal that many evidence-based practices are used infrequently or not at all, sometimes used at a concentration that is unlikely to have its therapeutic effect, to have its intended therapeutic effect. There's a lot of people out there in a number of different sectors who are using components of evidence-based practices, but infrequently is the concentration of them. Which it relates somewhat to fidelity, which Clay was talking about earlier. Is the concentration of that practice sufficient to have what would be expected to be a positive impact? And Clay was already talking about that when adopted, only 20 to 50% of programs wind up being implemented with fidelity. So we have an implementation problem. We know that multiple factors affect the implementation of research evidence in practice. This can be things like the contextual fit of practices, sort of whether they're appropriate and feasible in a particular service delivery context, whether that's a school, whether that's a primary care setting, whether that's in the juvenile justice system, anything like that. That local practitioner attitudes and concerns about structured protocols, sort of evidence-based interventions abound, sometimes are valid. I think that as much as I focus on implementing evidence-based practices that have usually been kind of developed over here in evidence-based practice development land and then are kind of being put in place in a number of different real-world contexts, I think that we can do a lot better to create practices that are more implementable, that are better designed, that are more intuitive, that sort of don't have some of those barriers that have inhibited some uptake. And then, of course, there's the quality of the implementation processes and those multi-level implementation processes that I'll be talking about. But overall, I just want to make this point at the bottom. Implementation science is predicated on the notion that the use of research and practice will improve service outcomes. We're not implementing evidence-based practices for their own sake, because we like evidence-based practices and we want to see people doing them. We're doing that because that's one of the best mechanisms we've identified to improve outcomes. And I think sometimes it's easy, especially when talking about implementation science, which, as I'll get into, is often about implementation strategies affecting implementation outcomes, and I'll talk about kind of what both of those are. It's possible to lose sight of the fact that we're here to improve outcomes, and the ultimate goal is improved outcomes, not the use of evidence-based practices. I just wanted to make a quick, just do some quick distinguishing between dissemination and implementation. I think once upon a time, these were often used interchangeably, but at this point, we've kind of gotten to a place where dissemination is really targeted distribution of information and information materials to an audience, right? Whereas implementation is the use of specific strategies to adopt and integrate evidence-based interventions and changes into specific settings. So one of them is kind of passive. Dissemination is, I mean, in some ways, dissemination is what people used to do and realized didn't work. And then we got to the point of focusing more on implementation. Implementation is making it happen. Dissemination is sort of letting it happen. This definition of implementation science comes from the inaugural issue of the journal Implementation Science, which was first published in 2006. Implementation research is the scientific study of methods to promote the systematic uptake of research findings and other evidence-based practices into routine practice, and hence to improve the quality and effectiveness of health services. It includes the study of influences on healthcare professional and organizational behavior. Or, as Dean Fixon, who's sort of an implementation guru, put more succinctly, the science and practice of using science in practice. And I do think that implementation has become something that has sort of identifiable science and practice elements. And part of what we're doing, as an aside, not related that much to what I'll be talking about today, is we're trying to, I'm part of an organization, the Society for Implementation Research Collaboration, CIRC. And one of the things we're really focused on is ensuring collaboration across different sort of implementation stakeholders. Researchers, intermediaries, which Clay has labeled all of you as, who are really doing the implementation practice and are doing sort of the work of implementation in real world settings and supporting people who are going to be using practices. And other kinds of local champions, and facilitating sort of their alignment and collaboration in order to avoid sort of a replication of the science to practice gap that we see in other kinds of service delivery, right? We have implementation science in order to address the science to practice gap, right? We have people doing science over here and deciding what works or what they think works, and we have people over here doing practice. And to bridge that gap is why we've created implementation science. But of course, as with anything, we run the risk now within implementation science of our own science to practice gap, incredibly ironically. So we're really trying to avoid that. So I want to talk just a little bit about implementation frameworks and implementation strategies, and it turns out we have a lot of both. Implementation frameworks are these proposed models of factors that are likely to impact implementation and sustainment. And I'll be talking about one framework in particular, but that doesn't mean it's the best framework. There's no sort of best or winning framework. I'll be talking about that one because it sort of has lent itself well to some of the work that we've done. But these are frameworks that are articulating sort of different system level and organizational level and team level and individual level and intervention level factors that are relevant. And there's implementation strategies, and these are systematic processes to adopt and integrate evidence-based innovations into usual care. Training, specific kinds of training could be an example of one type of implementation strategy, and I'll talk about more implementation strategies in just a minute. So even though dissemination and implementation science is just beginning to develop, we already have at least 61 models and frameworks. So if you're thinking about coming up with an implementation model or framework, don't, because we have enough, please. And like I said, there's really no winning framework or strong evidence to suggest that one framework is superior to another. I think that some of them are better, sort of lent to different kinds of purposes. Some of them focus more on sort of one particular level, but for the most part, these are all sort of multi-level enterprises. This is one framework. This is it's a conceptual model for implementation research developed by Onola Proctor and colleagues at WashU in St. Louis. And they have something called the Implementation Research Institute. And what they've articulated here, I think, is a useful way to sort of think about what's important in implementation science and how it fits in to what's really important for going into a setting and trying to improve the quality of services. So of course, we start with evidence-based practices here on the left. And where implementation science really comes in is focusing first on these implementation strategies. And these implementation strategies can occur and should occur at multiple levels. So it may be sort of an organizational change effort, which could include something like training leadership. We've talked a lot about leadership already, and I'll talk about leadership a bit more today. But ways to train leadership to more effectively model and engage in sort of evidence-based practice promoting behaviors, and how that can sort of trickle down through an entire system. It could also be things like group learning-based or supervision or consultation or coaching-driven kinds of strategies. Because we know one of the most robust findings within the field of implementation science is that train and hope doesn't work. That some type of post-training consultation is critical if you actually want to affect change, if you actually want to change people's behavior. You can change their knowledge, you can impart skills, but you're not going to be able to actually improve reliably behavior in the real world without some sort of support. Then we have our implementation outcomes. These are things like fidelity. I think that's probably the big one. That's kind of the cornerstone of a lot of what we do. Is something being delivered as intended? But also things like penetration. Penetration, also known as reach, sort of the extent to which people in a given service system, kids, families, anyone, who would be appropriate for a particular intervention are receiving that intervention. And there's other ones as well, including things like cost. Then sort of flowing through that, right, these are kind of our mediating variables. Flowing through that, out of that, we have our service outcomes, right? The efficiency, safety, effectiveness of the program that's being delivered. And then from that, we have our sort of client or individual level outcomes and things like satisfaction and functioning, symptoms, things like that. So there's a lot of different models, as I talked about, but there are a lot of commonalities across these different models. The first is that they are very frequently, almost exclusively, multi-level. And that is really critical, given that implementation science is largely about systems. And it's about sort of recognizing the complexity of systems and that there's a lot of different people who play a lot of different roles within systems. And identifying concerns at different levels and ultimately strategies to address issues at different levels. Maybe it's an issue of an implementation team and how that particular team is functioning and maintains knowledge within the team so that it can kind of, even if there's turnover, it can be robust to turnover, and that a team that sort of has the knowledge of how to deliver a particular practice can almost have this, to sort of take an analogy from computer systems, sort of a distributed network approach to being able to implement a particular program so that people may sort of cycle off or go and take a different job somewhere, but new people coming in can be sort of socialized to, trained in, and supported in the delivery of a practice. Most implementation frameworks are also multi-phase. suggesting that these things really do play out over time, that there are more or less identifiable or critical things that are happening sequentially across time, that there are sort of decisions that are made and there are different kinds of efforts. People are still trying to tease apart sort of what's most important at different phases, but thinking about implementation in terms of a multi-phase model. What influences people's initial decision to adopt something, or an organization's initial decision to adopt something, and what's sort of critical and what do they need at that point, versus way on the other end at the sustainment phase. What's going to keep something going? Even if it was implemented well, we know that things frequently, typically, aren't sustained well over time, over 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. So one of the things that a sort of multi-phase framework can do is help to think about and kind of conceptualize, because that's what really all these do, right? All models are wrong, some are useful. So they're helping us to think about what could be important, what do we need to think about, what do we need to drive our thinking over time. So we also know that the relevant variables, as I talked about, are not really those that have necessarily been emphasized in traditional sort of outcome research, right? Those things like fidelity, penetration, cost, feasibility, those aren't the kinds of dependent variables, right? The dependent variable which is influenced by whatever you're manipulating, say, in your study, that those aren't necessarily what's been looked at traditionally, and that's why we sort of have an emerging science specific to this. A lot of these frameworks also are good at describing important variables, saying this is important, and this is important, and this is important. But very few frameworks, and they're starting to get there a little bit, but very few implementation frameworks are great at predicting relationships and saying, well, we know if you make this change, it's likely to sort of have this influence on another variable. Frameworks also emphasize the bidirectional relationship between innovations and the context in which they're being implemented. This sort of notion of appropriateness, and thinking about sort of interventions in this way, I think really underscores how critical adaptation to one extent or another. How much? We don't know. Because you don't want to adapt too much, right? Because then you're not delivering something with fidelity. But some level of adaptation, either of the intervention or of the context, is critical if you're actually going to implement. I'm a firm believer that there is no implementation without adaptation. It has to be very thoughtful and should still reflect sort of the core components of an intervention. Not that we always know what those are, but if you're really going to take something into a new context, I'm a firm believer that some level of adaptation is going to be critical. So moving on to implementation strategies, the sort of specific things that one may do in order to promote uptake and sustained use of an intervention in a new service system. It turns out we have 68 implementation strategies. Just kidding, we actually have 73. I think this, and I think it's going to continue to grow. And this is really, to me, an indicator of kind of the infancy of this particular field and the things that are still being learned, the things that are still being created. This was part of a study that some colleagues of mine did where they pulled in experts to evaluate different implementation strategies that they had sort of generated themselves and to organize them and rate them with regard to their feasibility and their importance. And what you see here is that when they did this activity and mapped all 73 implementation strategies with regard to feasibility, which is over here on the left, and importance, which is on the bottom, you actually saw linear trends. I think that's good news, right? Where the implementation strategies that were rated as being more important were also more feasible. So these are things like, here's one that was rated as low importance and low feasibility. Change accreditation or membership requirements. So work with an accrediting agency or maybe a state body or something like that in order to change requirements for what it means to sort of be an accredited practitioner within a particular domain. So that's something that both people felt was not particularly important relative to others and not particularly feasible. Up at the other end, we have assess for readiness and identify barriers and facilitators, which I think makes pretty intuitive sense that would be absolutely critical to an implementation effort. And it was rated both as feasible and important. Something in between would be use train-the-trainer strategies to provide training to individuals who can then go forth and train others. So that's sort of in the middle. I mean, that takes some doing and certainly has some cost associated with it. And there's actually, I think, the final slide in this whole deck, which you should have in front of you, is a link or a reference for the paper that sort of details what all of these different implementation strategies are. The other thing that these folks did was they mapped implementation strategies in order to sort of see what clusters together, what sort of seemed, how do these hang together, and what might be these sort of overarching categories of implementation strategies. And you have things like, okay, generally some of these are engaging consumers, some are using evaluative or iterative strategies, some are focusing on changing infrastructure, some are just dedicated to supporting clinicians either initially or over time in the use of a new practice. So you get a sense of the kinds of strategies that are out there. And a lot of the assessment that we're talking about is ultimately in service of figuring out what kinds of strategies may be most important to sort of address a particular implementation issue. Now, strategies, if effective, theoretically improve implementation outcomes. So these are the outcomes articulated, again, by Enola Proctor and her group. These include things like acceptability, which is largely satisfaction, adoption, so sort of that initial decision to implement something, that sort of initial adoption decision. It's often described as sort of like it's almost like a one-time thing. You decide you're going to do it. How well it goes, that's another matter. Appropriateness, that's really this contextual fit or compatibility with context. Feasibility, so sort of to what extent, separate from something like appropriateness, is it actually feasible to do this? Fidelity, which we've talked a lot about already. Cost, which is fairly self-explanatory, but very infrequently assessed in a lot of these studies. Penetration, which I was also talking about, and sustainment over time. And we don't really know how long, and I think it's largely driven by the context, how long sustainment takes, like how long does something have to remain in place in order to say that it's sustained? In a school, I would argue at least an entire year once you've made it through the summer and most things have evaporated in everyone's minds. But I think these timelines are often arbitrary. So I want to go through a couple key implementation findings, some of which I've already touched on. One, implementation is long and hard. And sometimes this is something that those of us who do a lot of implementation and study implementation, I think, just tell ourselves so that we can feel better about times when implementation doesn't go as well as we would like it to. But we know that full implementation can take 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, sometimes 5 years in order to get a new program in place to the extent that we want it to be. And what's the problem with that? What's that? So turnover can certainly be something that sort of negatively impacts your ability to put something fully in place. And often when we're implementing a new practice and there's some sort of pressure for evaluation surrounding it, there's pressure for that evaluation to happen quickly, sometimes within months of actually implementing a new practice. And when you try to evaluate something that isn't fully implemented, regardless of its potential to actually be effective, what's going to happen? You're going to get a null finding. You're going to evaluate something and conclude, perhaps erroneously, perhaps accurately, that something isn't effective. So it's I think, very important to sort of think about things like the implementation outcomes I was just talking about, and whether those are indicating a program is actually fully in place or sufficiently in place in order to even evaluate its effectiveness. Number two, multi-component training and implementation programs may be more effective than single strategies. Again, or not. It's been sort of I think a commonly accepted and fairly well substantiated truth within implementation science that multi-level and multi-component interventions, so like implementation interventions, are more likely to be effective. But there was just recently some work done. It was actually in the domain of diabetes care, and they were sort of implementing more sort of complex psychosocial interventions related to the care for diabetes, and they were finding in their sort of review of reviews of people who had engaged in these kinds of efforts that that multi-component intervention strategy or implementation strategies were not necessarily more effective. In general, I think they are, but again, I think this is an indicator that we're still learning a whole lot about how implementation works and how to do it successfully. I'm back from training. I got a big binder. The training is already forgotten, but the binder will live forever. A living monument to temporary knowledge. Anyone who does a lot of implementation has probably shown this cartoon at one point or another, because this really maps onto, as I think I said earlier, one of the most robust findings within implementation science. That ongoing contact is essential in order to produce practice change following training. How much? We don't know. What kind of follow-up? Not really sure about that either. But we know it's absolutely critical. This table comes from it comes from a meta-analysis, and the table itself was produced in some work that Dean Fixon and colleagues did. But what this meta-analysis did, sort of a famous one by Joyce and Showers, that they looked at the effects of training and coaching on teachers' implementation in the classroom of new practices. And what they found was that, okay, if you do like demonstration and training, and even if you provide practice and feedback in the training itself, you can improve knowledge, you can improve skill, but you're not going to get anywhere when it comes to actual use in the classroom unless you have some sort of coaching, some sort of post-training support that really allows people to kind of get over that hump, right? Because that's really what it is, that there's this opportunity or this sort of difficulty taking it out of the actual training, the sort of time-limited training, and getting people to engage in those new practices. Even with successful initial implementation, high levels of program sustainment are notoriously difficult to achieve. So research on sustainment is often retrospective and doesn't have great methodological rigor. But even so, we find that partial sustainment is common. Partial sustainment means you come back, in a year and only some of the people are doing it, or people are only doing some of it, but that the entire program isn't being delivered as intended anymore, if at all. And then 5, implementation efforts need to attend to the larger context and system in which implementation is occurring. And this includes both the inner context. The inner context is sort of the more immediate organizational context that, it might be the school, could potentially be the district, where people are actually embedded and are delivering this new innovation, as well as the outer context. And the outer context is the sort of larger system, the policy context. It could be influenced by a number of different things. It's harder to change, I would say, the outer policy context, right? So most people in implementation are typically focusing on the organization, this inner context, these inner context factors, things like the climate, leadership, and how people are interacting with one another in order to drive implementation forward. We've found in some of our work that intervention setting fit, which is sort of how well a particular innovation fits into an organizational context, sort of into the inner context, has a number of different characteristics. We looked at both practical and values-based aspects of fit. Practical is sort of how well does this innovation align with current practices, current sort of procedures and timing and sort of these practical constraints within the setting. And then values-based as well. How well do these practices align with the theoretical orientation of the provider? How well do these align with the cultural norms of the families and kids who are receiving these practices? And we found both were important. Practical issues were usually discussed more commonly than values-based, but both were certainly present and critical, especially at the individual kid level and at the clinician level. A bad system will trump a good program every time. And although this is, I find this comment a little pejorative. I still think it makes a very, very good point. And the point is that organizational processes are absolutely critical when we're thinking about implementation. Even if you have the most motivated and engaged learner, trainee who really wants to go out and do it, they can be crushed by a system that isn't supportive of the new practice. So inadequate attention to these larger issues is likely to cripple even the most well-resourced and thoughtful implementation efforts. So why do we consider different levels of change? This is a slide that comes from my colleague Greg Ahrens, who's really pushed a lot of this work forward. So each of these different levels of change has a kind of its own assumption about why change happens. At the larger system or environment level, sort of the outer context level, the assumption is that reimbursement, legal, and regulatory procedures are key to sort of the implementation of new practices. At the organizational level, the assumption is that structure, sort of the way the organization is structured, and strategy, sort of how the organization goes about achieving its goals, are key to successful implementation. At the group or team level, the assumption is that cooperation, coordination, the shared knowledge are key to be able to implement something effectively. And at the individual level, we have the assumption that individuals' knowledge, that their skill in delivering something, and that their general expertise are key to doing this. And of course, all of these are key. And all of these need to be considered, even though you obviously can't try to impact all of them simultaneously. This is a framework developed by our colleague Greg Ahrens and his colleagues in San Diego that lays out sort of a lot of different factors for considering how implementation sort of gets done. And there's sort of two pieces to it, both this slide and the next one. But it articulates, okay, the outer context factors, things like the service environment, the sort of larger legislation, leadership and policy, the inter-organizational environment, so sort of how different organizations that may be reflected in the inner context over here are interacting with one another, and what the relationship is among these different organizations. In between here you have different types and levels of fit, sort of evidence-based practice system fit, organizational fit, provider fit, patient-client fit, sort of this appropriateness construct, right? Compatibility with context. And then over here we have the inner context, which are things like intra-organizational, within the organization factors, leadership, policy structure, organizational culture, organizational climate. I'll distinguish those in a minute. And these other factors that, that relate to and also influence individual adopter characteristics. So there we have things like attitudes, beliefs, knowledge, pieces like that. So you take this, which sort of gives a broad overview of what's important. Lots of things are important. How can we organize this in a way that could potentially be useful when implementing a new practice? And this is the EPIS framework: exploration, preparation, implementation, and sustainment. Again, this is one framework of many. This is one we've found useful, so I'm using it as an example for how a phased model might be able to inform some of the work that we do. But we have this sort of initial exploration phase when you're working to determine sort of what the plan is and what might be going forward, like whether you're looking to identify a particular practice and who's going to be critical to that effort, and what sort of the strategy is going to be. The preparation phase, where you've decided that you're going to do this and you're going forward and getting ready to move into active implementation. Active implementation, where you're actually providing supports, and then sustainment afterward, when those supports are removed, ideally in a tapered way, and you're going forward assuming, hoping that the program can continue in the absence of the supports that characterize the active implementation phase. So the outer context, as I already talked about, focuses on these social or political funding issues, is influenced by legislation and advocacy, should reflect, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, sort of consumer needs, and also is comprised of some of these inter-organizational networks. The inner context which we like to discuss using the term the organizational implementation context. Includes school and district climate, principal leadership, school personnel characteristics, all of these as they relate to implementation success. And it's really the organizational implementation context that I'll be talking about kind of for the remainder. So we've detailed just a way of thinking about some of the critical dimensions, again, informed by the work of our colleagues Greg Ahrens and Mark Earhart, to think about how in schools we can conceptualize some of these dimensions of the organizational implementation context. And we've really focused on strategic implementation leadership, and strategic is a strategically chosen word. And the reason we call it strategic implementation leadership, and this isn't necessarily terminology that we came up, that we've borrowed from our colleagues, is because it's characteristics of leadership that are specific to implementation. A set of strategic leadership behaviors are those that promote implementation of evidence-based practices. We also have strategic implementation climate, which is again strategic in the sense that it's specific to implementation, and it's factors of the organizational climate, which can include many different things, that are likely to be influenced, or they're likely to influence implementation of evidence-based practices. And then implementation citizenship behavior. And this is the extent to which individuals within an organization are going above and beyond and are sort of volunteering to support a new implementation effort, are sort of doing some self-directed learning, keeping up on the literature, different kinds of things that would support this effort, but again, sort of fall outside of their typical job duties. So I really like this figure, which is why I took it from our colleague Greg. Because I think it does a really nice job of articulating how these different constructs sort of fit together, and that it begins with, and I think this resonates really well with some of the discussion that we had earlier surrounding the role of leadership, because in this model, leadership is sort of the driving force that sits at the top and sets some of these other wheels in motion that ultimately impact successful implementation. So we have sort of leadership driving climate, that leaders are engaging in behaviors that are creating sort of a conducive climate for implementation that is then subsequently influencing the extent to which people in that organization are able to implement effectively and be effective in their job and ultimately reach better client outcomes. So let's start with strategic implementation leadership. So I want to distinguish strategic implementation leadership from sort of general leadership qualities. There's a large body of literature focused on what makes an effective leader, what are the different sort of types of leaders you can have. It's fairly well established that there are transformational and transactional leaders. Transactional leaders down here are those who are really focused on maintaining the status quo, right? They're not sort of bringing in sweeping change. They're attending to standards and trying to sort of support people in continuing along kind of the given path that an organization is on, not necessarily inspiring people to do different things or shaking that up too much. Transformational leaders come in and are more likely to promote things like intellectual stimulation and to motivate people and sort of come in often with this sort of idealized view of how the organization should function and are more likely to enact change. Strategic implementation leadership is somewhat separate from this. It could map onto some of these to one extent or another, but it's really focused on leadership that supports implementation of evidence-based practices. Strategic leadership exerts its influence at an interactional level, and strategic leaders communicate regularly with staff, protect time during meetings to discuss strategic content related to implementation, provide ongoing feedback based on performance, again, related to implementation, and are sort of engaging in these really specific behaviors that should be promoting an implementation-friendly climate and implementation-friendly behaviors among people working in that organization. Strategic implementation leadership works through these sort of embedding mechanisms. These are things like what leaders pay attention to, what they measure, what they control. We all know what gets measured gets done. And when leaders are attending to certain things and reacting to different kinds of behaviors and events within their organization in a way that sort of demonstrates an interest in and priority for implementation, then you sort of have these, then you have a situation where there is sort of strategic implementation leadership occurring. I'm going to keep going. In schools, there hasn't been a lot of explicit research on strategic implementation leadership, but we do know that strong principal leadership is identified frequently as a requirement for adoption and use of SEL programs, that there's a lot of research sort of supporting the notion that administrators are critical to EBP uptake and sustainment, and that elements of strategic school leadership have been shown to increase staff productivity and promote sort of this extra effort. And this extra effort is what plays out in implementation citizenship behavior. Moving on to strategic implementation climate, I just want to distinguish quickly between culture and climate. Organizational culture is this sort of set of implicit norms and assumptions about a work unit that guide behavior, whereas climate is a little more how it's felt by individuals, employees' perceptions, and affective responses to their work environment. And I have a colleague, Charles Glisson, who's done a lot of work, especially within youth mental health services, surrounding climate and culture. And he says, okay, we can change climate in a year or two, but it takes at least 3 or 4 years to really change culture. And that this is lower hanging fruit, even though any organizational change is certainly an endeavor. Strategic implementation climate is staff's shared perception about the importance of, guess what, EBP implementation. This includes staff perceptions of norms and expectations with regard to implementation. In schools, even though there hasn't been much research on strategic implementation climate, a high level of order, safety, and clear norms is associated with greater success in school reform efforts. This differs, of course, from global school climate. There's a very large, very extensive literature on global school climate, but which is, I think, a much, much larger construct. We're really talking about a specific component of global school climate. I want to talk a little bit about citizenship behavior now. So these citizenship behaviors, implementation citizenship behaviors, are those that demonstrate a commitment to evidence-based practice by keeping informed about the evidence, about the practice being implemented, and supporting colleagues to meet EBP standards. Again, going above and beyond to support this initiative. There's a subset of, these are really a subset of global organizational citizenship behaviors, again, in keeping with this theme throughout all of these different constructs, that these are targeted sub-constructs that support the specific objective of implementation. The importance of implementation citizenship behavior is supported by a lot of research from the industrial organizational literature. Right? So in domains such as customer service and organizational safety, there's pretty strong evidence that that citizenship behavior is critical. But no research has evaluated implementation citizenship behavior in schools. We're hoping to change that. But obviously there's growing consensus that implementing evidence-based practices in schools is a team effort, right? And this, I think, is something that maps onto that fairly well. So what do we do, even if we know things about the organizational implementation context, what do we do with this information? One thing is to determine the level of school or district implementation readiness, right? And on the front end, could we evaluate these constructs? And this is something we're hopefully receiving a grant to begin to take a look at, and whether we can predict these kinds of things by evaluating some of these constructs. Low readiness, as we know, in general accounts for at least half of unsuccessful organizational change efforts. So there's a lot of reason to want to be able to successfully evaluate readiness prior to initiating an expensive implementation effort, because training people, providing support, is an incredibly costly endeavor. And because we know that failed implementation is associated with all of this time and resource loss. You dump all these things into it, and then maybe it's used, and even if it is, then it's not sustained. So I have a couple examples here of applications of these implementation strategies. So let's say we take strategic implementation leadership. So one component of strategic implementation leadership is, does the principal have the skills or knowledge to affect change, to sort of support this implementation effort? And if we're able to determine that, then it may inform how we recruit new leaders, how we select leaders within the organization, or how we train leaders in order to specifically support an implementation effort. I'm going to read another one. I actually have the implementation leadership scale here, which Clay's going to talk about in a minute. But I want to, just to sort of give you a little bit more of a flavor for what some of these constructs are and what kinds of strategies may map onto that. I'm going to tag team with Clay, and I'm going to give him one, and he's going to come up with, on the fly, he doesn't even know which ones I'm going to read, a strategy or two that could address that. Here, how about the first one? So this is the scale that's sort of been developed and that we're in the process of adapting for use in schools related to implementation leadership. Our school administrator has developed a plan to facilitate implementation of evidence-based practice.
So think about if you said no, the goal would be an implementation strategy would be to align and develop a roadmap that would be kind of a plan that could be executed in an incremental fashion to achieve an end goal, to have full-scale implementation. And what's the systematic process by which you're going to expose people to the information, engage in the follow-up support, and how will you monitor it over time? So we call it road mapping or creating a blueprint for implementation. That's one of the implementation strategies. If there is no blueprint, develop a blueprint that can be articulated, made visible from a leadership perspective to those who are going to implement. Would be one way to think about an implementation leadership strategy you could be a part of.
And maybe one more. Our administrator perseveres through the ups and downs of implementing evidence-based practice.
How could we express empathy and be a supportive colleague to say, stick with it? Human behavior change, we know this with students. Stick with implementation. Don't give up on implementation to improve outcomes. How can we stick with leadership as you're trying to move a system forward to carry out in the practice? And I mean this, think broader than your individual practices, like getting an FBA based behavior intervention place. Think about a tier 2 service delivery system within your school that you're a part of. Instead of my micro, I'm working with this. No, you're really trying to create an infrastructure of supports for kids who need it now and in the future. How do you help the leadership get on board with that and stick with all the barriers and ups and downs that are going to come along with that process as you're moving to get that level of support implemented in the school?
Thank you. And in the interest of time, I think I'll keep it moving. So strategic implementation climate. One component of this is, does the school focus on and provide educational support for evidence-based practices? So obviously increasing an emphasis on or explicit opportunities for evidence-based practice training could be one particular strategy, one fairly straightforward strategy to address sort of a suboptimal strategic implementation climate. Related to implementation citizenship behaviors, one component is, do school personnel willingly assist others in the implementation? If not, one thing that you might be able to do would be to modify incentive structures. These might be things that are, I know that sometimes modifying incentive structures in a financial sense is difficult or prohibited within schools, but even social incentives and sort of public recognition of people who are engaging in this extra effort, who are supporting the implementation, could be a sort of an appropriate way of going about that. I'm going to throw one more to Clay related to citizenship behavior and see what he has for us. Teachers or school staff help teach evidence-based practice implementation procedures to new staff.
So how could you leverage this within a school? You can think about identifying a few people who are champions and influential, aligning with them, get them and empower them to take somewhat of a leadership role and disseminate the information versus maybe leadership talking down to staff, cultivating people among the staff who could do it, and that aren't necessarily equally powerful in terms of their influence, because not all people are in the social network are equally influential. How do you find the influential folks, align with them, get them to implement, and put them in the role of sharing and encouraging their peers?
Thanks. Now you have one more thing you can evaluate Clay on. So really just in summary, because I think my time is over, implementation science is a rapidly expanding discipline. And we know that organizational influences are critical to successfully implementing in schools and in all sorts of other contexts, including but not limited to those that are focused on sort of health service delivery. Strategic implementation leadership, strategic implementation climate, and implementation citizenship behaviors represent important organizational constructs to consider when implementing behavioral health programming in schools, and can hopefully support the selection of implementation strategies. So that's what I have. This is the link which you should have to the paper that describes in more detail what each of those implementation strategies are. And that's all I have.
Thanks, Steve.